The hearing room inside the Federal Oversight Committee building was packed to the rafters, not because it was a major criminal case, but because of who was testifying. Congressman Byron Donalds, sharp suit, calm stride, unshakable eyes. The Florida representative had been called to testify in an oversight dispute over a new government vetting policy for political candidates, a policy critics said could allow unelected judges to question patriotism itself. What was supposed to be a dry administrative review had turned into a full-blown political spectacle. But it wasn't just policy on the table. It was loyalty. Cameras flashed as Byron walked toward the witness table. Social media feeds lit up instantly. Donalds walks into the lion's den. Every major network was covering the moment. The walls were lined with reporters, some of them skeptical, some quietly rooting for a moment that could be twisted or edited. At the head of the dais sat Judge Marion Kellor, a known firebrand appointed under a previous administration who had earned a reputation for theatrical confrontations. She tapped her gavel once, slowly. "Congressman Donalds," she said, her voice cold and clipped, "today's hearing concerns whether elected officials are in alignment with the Constitution and the national interest." Byron nodded. Understood. Kellor leaned forward. "Then let's begin with a simple question, something basic. Something that should be easy to answer." She looked up from her notes, pausing for dramatic effect. "Can you prove your patriotism?" The room went still. A dozen reporters froze mid-typing. The air felt like it thickened. The question, absurd on its face, was also explosive. Byron didn't blink. "You want me to prove my love for this country?" "I want a clear answer," Kellor snapped. "No deflection, no rhetoric. You're under oath. Tell us, what have you sacrificed for this country that gives you the right to challenge its systems?" Gasps. A few audible wows from the gallery. Everyone expected him to stammer, to lecture, to fall into a partisan defense. But Byron did something else. He leaned in, folded his hands slowly on the desk, and said 5 words that would soon be replayed in every corner of the internet. "Do you have a flag?" The courtroom was stunned. The judge raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me?" Byron adjusted the mic. His voice, now low and deliberate, filled the room. "You want me to prove my patriotism? Start by showing me a flag in this courtroom. Not a seal, not a slogan, an actual American flag. Because I walked into this room under oath to a constitution, and you didn't even bring the symbol of that constitution with you." The silence was deafening. He sat back, arms crossed, not defiant, but anchored. And then, without warning, the crowd in the back started clapping. Just a few, then more, until even the judge had to raise the gavel to quiet them down. This wasn't a routine hearing anymore. This was a reckoning. The judge looked rattled. It was subtle, just a twitch of her brow, a brief glance toward her staff, but it was there. Byron Donalds hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't insulted anyone. But his response, that one sentence, had flipped the power dynamic like a light switch. "Do you have a flag?" It wasn't just clever. It was cutting, not with anger, with truth. And the crowd in the chamber, once stiff and formal, now sat at full attention, phones aimed, recording everything. Judge Kellor cleared her throat. "The presence or absence of a flag," she said, "does not dictate the legality of these proceedings." Byron raised an eyebrow. "But it does say a lot about the heart of them, doesn't it?" Kellor shifted in her seat. "I asked you a direct question," she snapped. "What have you done to prove your loyalty to this nation?" Byron leaned forward, not with arrogance, with purpose. "You want a resume? Fine." He spoke clearly, each word landing like a hammer wrapped in velvet. "I grew up in Brooklyn to a single mother who worked 3 jobs. We didn't have generational wealth. We had grit. I put myself through school. I built a business. I paid taxes. I employed Americans. I raised a family that teaches our kids to stand for the anthem. I've stood by police in the streets and veterans at town halls. I've walked into hostile rooms, sat at tables where they hoped I'd stay quiet. And I spoke. The courtroom was dead quiet. And when I was elected, I swore an oath," he continued, "to the Constitution, not to a party, not to a camera, not even to comfort, to the country." He paused. "Let it settle." "And you're asking me to prove I love it?" Leslie, a reporter from CNN Live Desk seated behind the railing, whispered to her colleague, "He's flipping the whole hearing on its head." The judge tried to reclaim control. "This isn't a campaign rally," she barked. And this isn't a courtroom built for loyalty tests, Byron shot back, eyes now fixed on her. You want to test me? Test my record, test my votes, test my words. But don't you dare demand proof of love for the country I've bled for in every room I've walked into since I got here. That did it. The crowd, silent for minutes, erupted again, this time louder, longer. Some stood, not just supporters, some independents, some undecided. Even a former critic in the third row, a well-known op-ed columnist, slowly rose to his feet, stunned but clapping. And Byron? He stayed seated, because he wasn't performing. He was telling the truth. Judge Marion Kellogg pounded the gavel once, twice. The applause faded, but the energy in the room didn't. Order, she said sharply, though it was clear she no longer had it. Let's get back to the facts. You're not here to give speeches. Byron Donalds calmly adjusted his tie and looked her dead in the eye. I didn't give a speech, he replied. I gave you an answer. There it was again, not a shout, not an insult, but pure command. The kind that made people lean forward, not out of fear, but respect. Kellogg narrowed her eyes. Let me remind you, Congressman, this hearing is about ensuring public officials are fit to serve in positions of national trust. That includes their rhetoric, their values. Byron nodded slowly. Then let's talk about values. A murmur rolled through the crowd. The reporters knew this wasn't going to be a dodge. This was a pivot with teeth. My values aren't proven by sound bites, Byron said, locking eyes with the judge. They're proven by standing firm when it would be easier to stay silent. He glanced to the audience, then back to Keller. You sit here and question my patriotism, but let me ask you something. Judge, where were you when they tried to shut down churches during the pandemic? The room gasped. Where were you when veterans' funerals were limited to 10 people while celebrity galas were broadcast to millions? The judge flinched. Where were you, he continued, when parents were called domestic threats for speaking at school boards, or when people of faith were mocked for clinging to what makes this country free? Silence. You want to talk about values? Byron asked again. Fine. I value liberty. I value the right to speak, even when it's inconvenient. I value the Constitution, not just when it's trending, but when it costs me everything to defend it. A beat passed. No one moved. Even the stenographer's fingers had stopped. Byron's voice dropped to a near whisper. And I value a country where we don't have to prove our love for it, because we live it. A standing ovation erupted, this time with no hesitation. The entire back half of the room rose. Even some who disagreed with him politically couldn't help but stand. Judge Kellogg didn't gavel this time. She didn't speak. Because in that moment, it was clear. The judge had asked the wrong question to the wrong man on the wrong day, and Byron Donalds had just given America the answer it didn't know it had been waiting for. By now, every major network had cut into live programming. What was scheduled to be a minor procedural hearing had turned into a moment of national consequence. CNN, Fox, MSNBC, and even streaming platforms like Rumble and YouTube were displaying live Byron Donalds under fire and firing back across their banners. In the chamber, phones were raised like torches. No one wanted to miss what would come next. Reporters weren't scribbling. They were stunned. One AP journalist muttered aloud, "This is the most composed takedown I've seen in my career." Judge Kellogg took a deep breath and tried to regain her footing. Congressman, this isn't a town hall. You were summoned here to address concerns about your public statements, not to deliver campaign slogans. Byron didn't even blink. I'm not campaigning, he said. I'm clarifying. He paused, then leaned forward slowly, locking eyes with the judge. And let me clarify something else. You could hear a pin drop. I don't need your permission to love this country. I don't need your approval to defend its values. And I certainly don't need a robe and gavel to recognize what patriotism looks like. That line hit like a drumbeat. But you, he continued, you sit in that chair and pretend questioning my allegiance is noble. But here's the truth. If you have to interrogate patriotism, maybe it's because it scares you. The judge stiffened. You asked me to prove it, Byron said. So here it is. I've taken heat for standing with police. I've been dragged online for defending unborn life. I've been mocked on late-night shows for quoting the Declaration of Independence without irony. He looked to the audience, then back at Keller. And yet, I'm still here. Because patriotism isn't a badge you hand out, it's a price you pay. And I've paid it in full, that line echoed. People weren't just clapping, they were on their feet again. Even the court-martial at the side of the room tried not to smile. The judge, visibly shaken now, tried to speak. But Byron raised his hand and delivered the mic drop moment that would go viral before he even left the building. You questioned my love for America. I answered by reminding you of something more powerful than opinion, reality. And the reality is this. You don't get to gatekeep patriotism just because you're uncomfortable with the way it looks when it's wearing a different suit. The crowd was thunderstruck. Even journalists who had come prepared to spin the story walked out whispering the same thing. He didn't dodge. He detonated. The energy in the hearing room had transformed completely. What began as a tense, scripted proceeding now pulsed with something far more powerful. Conviction. Not outrage. Not performance. Conviction. Judge Marion Keller looked as if she'd swallowed her own gavel, her lips pressed thin, fingers clenched on the desk. The script was gone. The control dissolved. The plan to humiliate a congressman on live TV backfired magnificently. But Byron wasn't finished. He stood now, not out of disrespect, but principle. I was invited here under the pretense of accountability, he said, but what I see is a courtroom pretending to be a stage, and I won't be part of a play. He gestured subtly to the crowd, cameras, reporters, citizens in folded chairs. These people didn't come here for theatre. They came for truth. He turned slightly toward the gallery. Some of you watching this believe patriotism belongs to a particular political party. It doesn't. Some think it only lives in the military. It doesn't. Patriotism is a parent sacrificing sleep to provide, a cop running toward danger, a nurse staying late, a young man kneeling beside a flag-draped coffin. A hush fell across the room. Patriotism is showing up, even when you're unwelcome. Even when they call you dangerous or extreme or performative. Patriotism is refusing to hate your country just because it's not trending on your timeline. By now the entire audience was standing, not cheering loudly, just clapping slowly, purposefully. Even the stenographer had stopped typing. And then, the moment that took everyone's breath. An elderly man in a faded Korean War veteran's cap stood, placed his hand over his heart and said, loud enough for the mics to pick up, "That man just said what I've waited 70 years to hear in this room." Someone in the back wept. Another shouted, "Thank you, Congressman." Byron remained still. Let the moment settle. Let the emotion breathe. Then he turned back to Judge Keller. "I didn't come here to win," he said softly. "I came to remind this chamber what it looks like when someone still believes in the flag, even when it's not hanging behind you." You could hear gasps as people realized there still was no American flag visible in the courtroom, and somehow that said everything. Backstage, the courtroom tech director was overwhelmed. "Sir, we've got over 3 million people watching the live stream, and that's just YouTube," a young assistant said, eyes wide. "TikTok clips are already up. He's everywhere." Inside the chamber, Byron Donalds slowly returned to his seat. The judge said nothing. She didn't gavel, she didn't speak. And that silence said more than any ruling could. Byron looked across the panel, eyeing the other officials who had remained mostly quiet throughout the exchange. Some looked down. One leaned back, arms crossed, clearly reconsidering everything they thought they knew about this man. Outside, the internet was melting. On X, Byron Donalds just gave the speech of the decade, and he wasn't even supposed to speak. Mic dropped. God bless that man. That's not testimony, that's a masterclass in patriotism. On Instagram, clips of his quotes had already been subtitled and cut into reels. You don't get to gatekeep patriotism just because you're uncomfortable with the way it looks. I don't need permission to love this country. Patriotism is a price you pay. Even on platforms that usually weren't friendly to conservatives, the comment sections were full of unexpected admissions. Didn't think I'd ever agree with Byron Donalds, but this hit. I may not vote red, but that was real. He didn't scream. He didn't insult. He just told the truth, and it was impossible to ignore. Cable networks scrambled. Commentators flipped their tones mid-sentence. One late-night host who had mocked Donalds just days earlier tweeted, "When someone tells the truth so cleanly, even jokes feel disrespectful. Respect where it's due." But the most powerful moment wasn't online. It came from within the room. A young college student sitting near the rear raised her hand, trembling slightly. She hadn't come to support Donalds. She came to observe, but now she stood. "Congressman," she said gently, "what should someone like me do if I've been taught to believe loving your country makes you naive?" Byron's eyes softened. He stood again, slowly, and this time his words didn't aim for power, they aimed for hope. "Then you've been taught by people who stopped believing before they ever tried." He took a step forward. "Loving this country doesn't make you blind. It makes you brave. It doesn't mean you ignore its flaws. It means you fight for it anyway." He paused. "Don't ever let anyone shame you out of believing in something bigger than yourself, because the moment you do, the people who want to divide us have already won." Tears welled up in her eyes, and with that she clapped, not for him, but for what he gave her, permission to believe again. Judge Kellogg had stopped taking notes. She stared forward, not at Byron Donalds, not at the crowd, but at the marble floor just beyond her bench. The expression on her face wasn't anger now. It was something more rare. Doubt. The kind of doubt that creeps in when a person realizes they may have underestimated not just a man, but a movement. The room was still buzzing. Not with chaos, but respect. That rare kind of quiet applause that comes not from agreement, but from acknowledgement. Byron didn't speak again for several minutes. He allowed the silence to speak for itself. He had no intention of filibustering. He had already said what needed saying. But then, Judge Keller did something no one expected. She leaned toward her mic and said softly, "Congressman Donalds, I may not agree with everything you've said, but I'd be lying if I said your words didn't resonate." The room held its breath. Keller glanced toward her legal aides, then back to Byron. "I asked you to prove your patriotism," she continued. "And I now realize maybe that was the wrong question." Byron nodded, offering no smugness, just grace. "You asked the question a lot of Americans have been asking each other in frustration," he replied, "and I answered with what a lot of them have been feeling in silence." Kellogg sat back, a long pause. "Then this committee will recess for review." She banged the gavel once, gently, and stood. But even after she left the bench, most of the crowd stayed in their seats. Because it wasn't over. Backstage, producers from 3 networks waited for Byron, each one with urgent offers, exclusive interviews, follow-ups, Sunday show appearances. He didn't stop. He walked straight past them, out the side exit, and into a crowd that had already begun gathering outside the courthouse. Not for a rally, not for a protest, just to see him. An elderly black veteran saluted him as he passed. A young Latina mother held up her baby and whispered, "That's what a leader looks like." And someone in the back shouted, "You didn't testify, Byron. You woke us up." Cameras followed him, but Byron didn't stop to speak. He raised one hand, nodded at the crowd, and disappeared into the car waiting for him. Inside, his phone buzzed. A message from a staffer. "Sir, 38 million views in 4 hours. Twitter can't keep up. They're calling it the Patriots' hearing." Byron stared at the screen, said nothing, then looked out the window at the city rolling by, not with arrogance, not with pride, but with clarity. Because he knew something now, something bigger than the sound bites. America was listening, and this time it wasn't going back to sleep. Back in Washington, the headlines rolled in like waves hitting a stone monument. Byron Donalds dismantles patriotism question with calm precision. Fox News congressman's mic drop moment sparks national reaction. News Nation. Unexpected viral testimony leaves panel viewers stunned. The Hill. Donalds didn't shout. He didn't grandstand. He spoke, and the room stood still. The Atlantic. But none of those headlines captured what truly happened. It wasn't just a defense of patriotism. It was a defibrillator, a jolt to the conscience of a country that had grown numb to its own greatness. And while political operatives scrambled to either elevate or discredit the moment, Byron Donalds refused to play the game. He skipped every TV invitation. He posted no victory lap on social media. He issued no statement. Until the next morning. At 8:03 a.m., Byron posted one simple photo on his feed. It was a picture of the hearing room, empty now, still, quiet. The caption, "The loudest truths echo when the microphones are off." In minutes, it became the most shared political post of the year. Comment sections filled with declarations. That wasn't a performance, that was a testimony. He didn't drop a mic, he dropped a mirror and made us look. No theatrics, just spine. But something else began to happen, something Byron didn't plan. Veterans, teachers, police officers, small business owners and high school students began recording short videos finishing a now viral sentence. You don't get to gatekeep patriotism, because I. And the reasons poured in. Fought for this country in 1968. Lost my brother in Fallujah. Prayed every night for my son in uniform. Raised a daughter who still stands for the pledge even when no one else does. Byron watched in silence. He didn't retweet them. He didn't post replies. He let the people speak, because the moment was no longer his. It was theirs. And across the country, something was spreading that algorithms couldn't measure. Pride. Not in party, not in politics, in country, not performative pride, but personal. Quiet, earned. And it all started not because Byron shouted louder than his critics, but because he stood taller than their expectations. In cities and small towns across America, something had shifted. Not in anger, but in awareness. In Texas, a group of high school students paused morning announcements to play a 60-second clip from Byron's testimony. In Michigan, a retired auto worker uploaded a video saying, "I haven't stood for anything in years, until that man reminded me I still could." In Oregon, a barista printed a quote from the hearing and taped it to the front counter. "Patriotism isn't a badge you hand out, it's a price you pay." And in Washington, D.C., something unusual happened. Even critics on the opposite side of the aisle began acknowledging the moment. One progressive columnist, known for biting satire, wrote, "I disagree with Byron Donalds on 90% of policy, but what I saw in that courtroom wasn't politics. It was a man carrying the weight of a nation's forgotten soul and reminding us that belief, spoken plainly, can still silence a room." The House Speaker, without announcement or press release, quietly ordered American flags installed behind every hearing table that lacked one. When questioned, she simply replied, "It was time." Meanwhile, Judge Marion Kellogg, the same woman who demanded Byron prove his patriotism, released a rare statement. It didn't apologize. But it did concede something profound. In our effort to preserve the integrity of democratic institutions, we must never forget that patriotism cannot be measured by volume or political affiliation. Sometimes it walks into the room quietly and reminds us all why the room exists. Back in Florida, Byron Donalds returned to work like nothing had happened. No interviews, no press tour. When asked by a reporter outside the Capitol how it felt to go viral, Byron just smiled and said, "Virality fades, values don't." But even as he tried to return to business, America had other plans. The hearing, now dubbed the Patriots' Reckoning, was being studied in debate classes, law schools, and even seminary homilies across the country. And the phrase that once felt accusatory, "prove your patriotism," had been reclaimed. Not as a challenge, but as a calling. Not with words, but with lives, with sacrifice, with standing firm when silence is easier. And Byron had done that, not just for himself, but for everyone who had been waiting for someone to say, "You don't have to wear a uniform to love this country, you just have to carry its truth." Weeks passed. The viral frenzy faded, as all things do, but something lingered, a stillness in the storm, a clarity in the chaos. It wasn't just the clip, it was what it uncovered. One Monday morning, in a small town in North Carolina, a father of 3 walked into a local government meeting. He wasn't an activist. He wasn't running for office. He just had one question. "Why isn't there a flag in this room?" He wasn't angry, just honest. Within hours, one was raised. Not for show, for reminder. Across the country, Americans weren't just quoting Byron Donalds. They were acting, quietly, decisively. Flags were put up, pledges reinstated, history lessons rewritten, not to erase pain, but to include pride. A movement had emerged, not a movement with a hashtag or donation link, a movement of memory. The memory that loving your country wasn't corny. That standing wasn't performative. That silence wasn't the only polite option. And Byron, he kept walking forward. No campaign launch, no book deal, just the work. He held town halls that filled faster than ever before. Not with cheering crowds, but with listening citizens. People weren't looking for a hero. They were looking for a reflection. One night, after a particularly long day, Byron stayed late at his office. The Capitol had emptied. The air was still. He walked down a hallway most never use, toward a little-known balcony that overlooks the National Mall. He stood there alone, gazing out at the Washington Monument. The city glittered under the night sky. Then a staffer approached quietly with a small envelope. "Sir, this came in today. Thought you'd want to see it." Byron opened it. Inside was a photo. A folded American flag placed inside the hearing room, mounted in a new frame, behind the witness chair where he had once sat. Attached was a handwritten note, unsigned. "You reminded us what belongs here. We put it back." Byron stared at it for a long time. Then, for the first time since that day, he smiled. Not for the cameras, not for the record, but because something he believed was finally being believed by others. Not through argument, but through example. Because patriotism didn't need proving, it needed remembering. And he'd done that, without shouting, just by standing.